They said the axe was just decoration. A rusted family heirloom the human maid kept bolted above his locker because regulations required staff to display one item of cultural significance. Nobody on Aurelian Spire had ever seen Ellis Marsh touch it. Nobody had ever seen him raise his voice either. That was about to change. The Lumen Guard was still congratulating themselves on a flawless perimeter sweep when the alarms should have gone off. They didn't. Somebody had made sure of that. And when the first Seraph Guard turned to run, not fight, not fall back, run down the gilded promenade, screaming in a language his own translator couldn't keep up with, Ellis Marsh was already standing over 3 dead men with an axe that had gone from dull steel to a wet, dripping crimson under the emergency lights. Behind him, Princess Ione pressed a shaking hand against his shoulder, like she needed to confirm he was still real. He didn't blink. He hadn't blinked once, 6 hours earlier. Ellis had been on his knees, scrubbing candle wax off the marble baseboards of the East Gallery, humming an old country song under his breath that nobody on this station would ever recognize. He was 54 years old, built low and wide like a man who'd spent 30 years hauling sides of beef off a hook because that's exactly what he'd done. 22 years running the family butcher shop back in Lubbock before the debt ate it alive. A chain grocery moved in 2 blocks over. Undercut his prices by margins he couldn't survive. And within 18 months, the shop his grandfather built was a vape store. He'd been 50 years old, broke, and staring down a future of stocking shelves at the same chain that killed his business, when a recruiter with an off-world contract and a signing bonus that made his eyes water found him in a diner outside Lubbock. Domestic maid staff needed. Diplomatic wing Serath Dominion. Hazard pay for qualifying species. He hadn't asked what qualifying species meant until he was already 3 light years from Texas, strapped into a transport seat built for something with narrower hips and no idea what he'd signed up for. By the time he found out, over a briefing packet he barely understood, full of words like xenopsychology and threat differential, it was too late to change his mind, and honestly, the pay was too good to care. Turned out it meant humans didn't flinch at the things that made everyone else's stomach turn. You there. Wax boy. Ellis didn't look up right away. He recognized the voice. Commander Visarion, First Blade of the Lumen Guard. A Serath, nearly 8 feet of pale gold skin, and a crest of iridescent feathers that fanned out when he was pleased with himself, which was always. The Serath were an elegant people, willow-limbed, wide dark eyes set too far apart, evolved on a garden world so gentle their ancestors had never needed claws or fangs. They'd built an empire instead. Trade routes, treaties, opulence stacked on opulence, 1,000 years of diplomacy standing in for the teeth they'd never grown. What they hadn't built was a spine, and Ellis had figured that out within his first week on the Spire, watching how quickly the whole guard detail scattered from a maintenance drone that malfunctioned and started sparking near the throne room. "Commander," Ellis said, setting down his rag, "you missed the West Colonnade." Visarion's 4 attendants snickered behind him. Their ceremonial halberds, pure theatre, more jewelry than weapon, edges so decorative they wouldn't cut warm butter, catching the light. "Perhaps if the maids worked faster, we wouldn't need so many of you cluttering the halls." "I'll get to it," Ellis said. He didn't move faster. He never moved faster. Anger cost energy, and energy cost focus. And back on the killing floor, he'd learned that a man who rushed was a man who lost a finger. He'd carried that lesson with him off Earth, the way some men carried scripture. Visarion's crest flared. Offended by the lack of reaction, the commander liked his insults to land, liked watching something crack in the eyes of whoever he aimed them at, and the human's flat, unbothered stare always seemed to needle him more than any argument could have. He swept off toward the War Council chamber, with his entourage clicking their boots in unison behind him, the sound fading down the long marble hall like a retreating storm. Ellis watched them go and went back to his wax. "He's insufferable," said a voice from the archway, soft and amused. You know he's terrified of you." Ellis looked up. Princess Ione stood there in her pale blue court robes, 16 years old by Serath reckoning, closer to 20 in Earth years, with the same wide, dark eyes as her people, but none of the arrogance. She'd been sneaking down to the servants' gallery to talk to him for 4 months now, ever since he'd caught her crying behind a tapestry after her mother's memorial, and hadn't told a soul. He still remembered that night, how she'd flinched when he found her, expecting a reprimand for being somewhere a princess shouldn't be, and how confused she'd looked when he just sat down on the floor next to her instead and said nothing at all for 20 minutes. "Terrified of a maid?" Ellis said, allowing himself a small, dry smile. "Terrified of what you aren't afraid of." She sat on the marble step across from him, tucking her long legs beneath her robes, careless of the wax stains, the way she was never careless in front of anyone else on this station. "I read the file on your species. Class 7 predator ancestry. Your kind hunted things larger than yourselves for 200,000 years before you ever built a city." She tilted her head, studying him the way she might study an artifact in the Royal Archive. "We were prey animals who got lucky with tools. Ellis, that's the whole history of my people. If you strip away the silk and the treaties and the pretty speeches, that's a hell of a thing to say about your own kingdom, princess. It's the truth. My father built an empire out of treaties because none of us could ever build one out of teeth." She picked at a loose thread on her sleeve, and for a moment she looked younger than 16, younger than the crown that would someday sit on her head. "There's a reason the Lumenguard's shields are so beautiful and their armor is so heavy. We've never had to actually survive anything. We've only had to look like we could. My whole life I've watched grown men bow to my father and call him mighty, and I keep thinking, mighty compared to what? We've never fought anything harder than a trade negotiation." Ellis didn't answer that right away. He'd learned a long time ago that when a kid said something true and sad in the same breath, the kindest thing you could do was just let it sit there instead of arguing it away or rushing to comfort her out of a feeling she'd earned the right to have. "Something's wrong tonight," Ione said instead, quieter now, glancing down the empty gallery like she expected someone to be listening. "My father cancelled the evening reception without explanation. Just cancelled it, an hour before it was supposed to begin, no reason given. The Lumen Guard doubled the outer watch. I counted 12 extra men at the north checkpoint alone. And there's a supply shuttle docked at Base 6 that isn't on any manifest I've seen. And I've seen every manifest that comes through this station because I get bored and read them." She looked at him, and for the first time that evening, the amusement had gone out of her voice entirely. "I don't like it, Ellis." Ellis set his rag down slowly. 22 years of gutting animals had taught him to trust the part of his brain that noticed when something in a room had shifted, even before he could say what. The same instinct that told a man which cut of meat had turned before his nose caught up to the fact. And something in this station had shifted. He'd felt it since he clocked in that morning, a wrongness he couldn't name, thin as a hairline crack in a wall you only notice out of the corner of your eye. "Go back to your quarters, princess," he said. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone who isn't me or your father, and if it's either one of us, make us say something only we'd know first. Something specific, not a password you could guess." Ione's dark eyes searched his face. "You think it's serious?" "I think a butcher's got a nose for when the meat's gone bad," Ellis said, standing, his knees popping the way they always did now, the ache in them a permanent souvenir of 3 decades on a concrete floor. "And this whole station smells wrong tonight. Might be nothing. Might be your father's just in a foul mood and cutting corners on the reception budget. But humor an old man, all right." She didn't argue. She'd learned by now that when Ellis Marsh went quiet like that, flat and certain, it was time to listen instead of push back. She rose, pulled her robes tight around her, and disappeared down the east corridor toward the royal wing, her guards falling into step around her, 6 Lumen Guard in gleaming ceremonial gold, halberds catching the chandelier light, chests out, spines straight. looking every bit as unbreakable as the empire they served. Ellis watched her go until the last flash of gold armor turned the corner, then bent back down to his wax, because that was the job. And the job didn't stop just because his gut was screaming at him to follow her instead. He worked in silence for a while. The only sound, the wet drag of his rag against marble, and the distant hum of the station's climate regulators. He thought about Sarah, the way he always did in the quiet stretches, his daughter back on Earth. 3 years into her residency now, probably asleep at this hour, probably dreaming about something ordinary and safe, like exam schedules, instead of alien war councils and unmarked shuttles. He thought about how strange it was that he'd crossed the galaxy so she'd never have to worry about money, and how she still didn't know exactly what domestic maid staff meant when the fine print mentioned hazard pay. He was 3 strokes into the last candle stain when every light in the East Gallery died at once, not flickered, not dimmed, died. The whole station dropping into a silence so total he could hear his own pulse in his ears, could hear the small mechanical click of the climate regulators cutting out mid-cycle. A heartbeat later, the crimson emergency lighting bled up from the floor panels, painting the marble the color of a wound, throwing long red shadows across the pillars and the gilded ceiling murals Ellis had spent 3 years polishing. Somewhere down the east corridor, the corridor Ione had just walked into. The corridor, with 6 Lumen Guard and a princess and absolutely nothing that should have gone wrong. Ellis heard the first scream. It didn't sound like fear. It sounded like something being unmade. A high, tearing sound that didn't belong in a throat, that seemed to come from somewhere underneath the voice, instead of through it, and it cut off too fast. Swallowed by a second scream, and then a third, overlapping now. A chorus of something Ellis had no name for. He was already moving before he finished the thought, his hand closing around the mop bucket, then discarding it as useless weight. His boots pounding the marble he'd spent all night polishing, echoing down the empty gallery like gunshots. Behind him, in the dark of the staff quarters he was leaving behind, something on the wall was catching the red emergency light and throwing it back like it was already wet. The old rusted axe, hanging where it always hung, waiting. Ellis rounded the corner into the east corridor and stopped dead. The 6 Lumen Guard who'd flanked Ione minutes ago were scattered across the marble like dropped marionettes. Not dead, and worse somehow, curled in on themselves. Gold armor rattling against the floor as their bodies convulsed, hands clawing at their own faces, at their own ears, like they were trying to dig something out of their skulls. One of them was making a high, thin sound Ellis had only ever heard from an animal caught in a trap. The kind of sound that came right before the body simply gave up and stopped fighting whatever was killing it. Standing over them, indifferent to the noise, were 4 figures in matte grey combat wraps, faces hidden behind smooth, featureless masks. One held a small brass cylinder raised at shoulder height, and a low, subsonic hum pulsed from it, a frequency Ellis felt in his molars more than heard, a pressure behind his eyes that made his vision swim for half a second before it passed. He didn't understand the science of it. He didn't need to. What he understood, watching 6 trained soldiers writhe on the floor without a single blow landed against them, was that whatever was coming out of that cylinder had reached all the way down into some old, unmodified part of the Seraph brain, the part that had never stopped being prey, no matter how many treaties and trade routes their species had built on top of it, and switched every one of them off like a light. Ione had said it herself not 20 minutes ago. We've never had to actually survive anything. Now something had come looking to test that. The nearest masked figure turned at the sound of Ellis's boots on the marble, and Ellis felt the low hum crawl up through the soles of his feet, into his shins, up toward his chest, and stop there. It didn't take. It pressed against something and slid off, the way water beads on a waxed floor instead of soaking in. Whatever ancient nerve that weapon was built to pluck, humans simply didn't have it wired the same way. 200,000 years of hunting things that could kill you back had bred that particular fear reflex clean out of the species. Replaced with something colder and slower to panic, the masked figure tilted his head at Ellis, clearly reading the absence of a reaction as a malfunction in his own equipment, and raised the cylinder higher. Ellis didn't wait to find out what the second setting did. He'd left the axe behind, hanging on its bolts in the staff quarters, 40 feet and one very bad decision away, and he had exactly nothing in his hands but a wax-stained rag and 30 years of muscle memory built from swinging cleavers into sides of beef 8 hours a day. It would have to be enough. He closed the distance in 4 long strides, faster than a man his size and age had any right to move. And the masked figure barely got the cylinder halfway toward him before Ellis's fist connected with the side of his skull. The mask cracked. The figure went down hard, cylinder skittering across the marble, and didn't get back up. The other 3 reacted fast, professionals all of them, whatever else they were, spreading out into a loose triangle around him with quick, economical movements. One drew a short curved blade. The second raised a compact weapon that Ellis didn't recognize, but understood the shape of well enough, something meant to put holes in things. The third simply reached for the fallen cylinder. Don't let him get that back online, Ellis thought, and moved. He grabbed the nearest Lumen Guard's discarded halberd off the floor, decorative, useless as a weapon. Vasarian had said so himself not 2 hours ago, and swung it two-handed into the reaching figure's wrist just as his fingers closed around the cylinder. It wasn't sharp enough to cut. It didn't need to be. The impact alone snapped bone with a wet crack that made the man scream and stagger back, and the cylinder spun away under a fallen pillar. Out of reach, the one with the gun fired. The shot caught Ellis high in the left shoulder, a burning punch that spun him half around and dropped him to one knee. Blood already soaking hot through his shirt. He'd been shot once before, years back, some idiot customer's negligent discharge in the shop parking lot, and he remembered the same strange clarity that came with it now. Pain, arriving late, a half-second behind the wound itself, like his body needed a moment to process the insult before it started screaming about it. He used that half-second. He drove forward off his good leg, inside the gunman's guard before a second shot could line up, and drove the blunt end of the half-held halberd up under the man's jaw with everything his hips and shoulders had left in them. The mask cracked backward at an angle no neck should bend. The gunman folded and didn't move again. That left the blade. The last of the 4 came at him fast. Low, the curved edge flashing red in the emergency light, aimed at the meat of Ellis's thigh. A crippling shot, not a killing one. The kind of strike a man made when he wanted his target alive and slow. Ellis had gutted enough animals to know a blade's angle before it finished its swing, and he twisted his hips just enough that the edge caught fabric instead of flesh. Tearing his pant leg open without opening him, he grabbed the wrist behind the blade the way he used to grab a slipping cleaver handle. Fast. Total no hesitation, and pulled using the man's own forward momentum against him, redirecting all that speed into the nearest marble pillar. The masked figure hit it face first with a crunch that ended the fight before Ellis even had to throw a punch. Silence came rushing back into the corridor, broken only by his own ragged breathing and the low moaning of the Lumen Guard still curled on the floor, their nervous systems slowly, painfully rebooting. Ellis stood in the middle of it, shoulder burning, pant leg torn, 4 masked men down around him, and realized his hands weren't shaking. He'd expected them to be. He'd expected, after 22 years of nothing more violent than a stubborn cut of brisket, that his body would demand some kind of toll for what it had just done. Instead, there was just a flat, cold quiet in his chest. The same quiet he used to feel walking into the shop at 4 in the morning before the world woke up. "Ione," he said out loud, to no one, and started running again. He found the outer door to the royal wing already breached, its heavy panel wrenched half off its hinges by something with far more strength than the small brass cylinders should have allowed. Beyond it, the private hall leading to Ione's chambers stretched out in bloody red light. And at the far end of it, Ellis saw movement. 6 more figures in the same matte grey wraps, moving in tight formation toward a door that was still miraculously sealed. She'd locked it. She'd actually locked it, exactly like he'd told her. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have backup. He had a bleeding shoulder, one working leg that hurt less than the other, and 40 feet of hallway between him and the only person on this station who'd ever asked him a real question about his life instead of ordering him to fix something. He thought about the axe, hanging on its bolts, useless, 40 feet in the wrong direction. He thought about Sarah's graduation photo folded in his back pocket, and how none of this, not 1 second of it, was in the job description he'd signed back in that Lubbock diner. Then he stopped thinking, because thinking cost time he didn't have, and he ran straight down the hallway towards 6 armed men, empty-handed, the way a man runs toward the only thing left worth running toward. One of the masked figures at the rear of the formation heard him coming and turned, weapon rising, and froze for just a half-second at the sight of an unarmed human sprinting at full speed towards 6 armed operatives without so much as breaking stride. Without a flicker of the hesitation his training had told him to expect from every soft, garden world species this station had ever hired to mop its floors. That half-second was the only mistake he'd ever get to make. Ellis hit the rear guard before the man's weapon finished rising. He didn't throw a punch. There wasn't time, and a punch wasn't what 30 years on a killing floor had taught him anyway. He drove his whole body weight shoulder first into the man's chest, the same motion he used to use, hauling a quarter of beef off a delivery truck, and the impact folded the operative backward over Ellis's own hip, slamming him into the marble hard enough to crack the mask straight down the middle. The other 5 spun as one, and for the first time since the lights had died, Ellis saw hesitation ripple through the formation. Not fear exactly, not yet, but confusion. The specific confusion of trained men watching a variable behave in a way no briefing had prepared them for. That confusion cost them 2 more seconds. Ellis used every one of them. He grabbed a fallen halberd off the floor from one of the earlier casualties, decorative, blunt Viserian's precious ceremonial nonsense, and swung it in a wide, low arc across the shins of the 2 nearest men. It wasn't a killing blow. It didn't need to be. Both went down hard, and Ellis was already past them, driving the butt of the haft into a 3rd man's throat before he'd finished falling. The 4th got a shot off. The slug caught Ellis across the ribs, a line of white-hot pain that stole the air out of his lungs and spun him half around. And this time his knee did buckle, dropping him hard against the marble floor. Blood was running warm down his side now, joining the mess already soaking his shoulder, and for one long, terrible second the world tilted sideways and refused to come back level. Get up, he told himself, in the same flat voice he used to use on himself at 4 in the morning, alone in a freezing walk-in cooler, wrestling a side of beef that outweighed him by 200 pounds. Meat doesn't hang itself. He got up. The 4th man was already closing to finish it. Weapon raised, and Ellis didn't have the halberd anymore. He'd lost it in the fall, watched it skitter somewhere out of reach in the red emergency light. What he had was his hands, and a body that had spent 2 decades learning exactly where the soft places were on something built to be taken apart. He caught the gun arm as it came down, twisted hard enough to hear something give in the wrist, and drove his forehead into the mask before the man could scream. The mask cracked. The man dropped. That left one. The last operative, smaller than the others, quicker, hanging back the way a man hangs back when he's the one actually in charge, didn't rush in. He circled instead, weapon low, studying Ellis with the clinical patience of someone updating a mental file in real time. Bleeding from 2 wounds. Favoring the left leg now, slowing. "You're not on any manifest," the man said. His voice, run through a translator, came out flat and mechanical, but there was something almost admiring underneath it. "Domestic staff, unarmed, untrained. A pause. This wasn't supposed to cost us 4 men. Wasn't supposed to cost you your job either, Ellis said. But here we are. The door behind him, Ione's door, still sealed, still holding, rattled once hard, like something on the other side had thrown its weight against it. A voice, muffled, familiar, calling his name. The operative's masked head tilted toward the sound, calculating, and Ellis understood with total clarity that the moment this man decided the princess mattered more than finishing the fight, this conversation was over, and Ellis was going to lose the only thing that had made the last 6 hours worth surviving. He didn't wait for that decision to get made. Ellis charged. It wasn't smart. It wasn't trained. It was 30 years of muscle memory and one very simple, very old fact about his species. When something you loved was on the other side of a locked door, you didn't calculate the odds, you just went. The operative fired. The shot went wide, clipping Ellis's forearm instead of his chest. And then Ellis was inside his guard, too close for the weapon to matter, and his hands closed around the man's throat, with the exact grip he used to use snapping the neck of something already stunned on the killing floor. The fight ended fast after that. Ellis stood over the 6th body, breathing in ragged, wet pulls, blood running from 3 separate wounds now, and became aware distantly, the way you become aware of weather through a thick window, that his own legs weren't entirely steady anymore. The door behind him unlocked. Ione stood in the frame, pale, shaking, a decorative letter opener clutched in one hand like it might have actually helped if it had come to that. Her eyes went from Ellis's face to the 6 bodies scattered down the hallway, to the blood soaking through his shirt. And something in her expression cracked open. "You're hurt," she said. "I've had worse," Ellis lied, and immediately regretted it as the hallway tilted again. She caught his arm before he went down, smaller than him by 3 feet and 80 pounds, bracing under his weight with a strength that surprised them both. "Don't you dare," she said, voice fierce now, all the softness from 6 hours ago burned out of it. "Don't you dare fall down." Not now. That was when the comm panel on the wall crackled to life. Not the royal frequency, not station security, but a private channel Ellis recognized because he'd cleaned the terminal it ran through 100 times without ever knowing what it was for. "Phase 1 complete," said a voice Ellis knew. A voice that had spent the last 3 years calling him wax boy, ordering him out of rooms, sneering at every plate he'd ever carried. 6 down at the east perimeter. 6 more should be finishing the girl now. Confirm the kill, and I'll authorize the 2nd shuttle. Viserian's voice, Ione, went rigid against Ellis's side. That's the commander's private channel. That's your first blade selling you out." Ellis finished for her, low and cold, watching the comm panel like it might bite him. Man who spent 3 years telling everyone how weak humans are. He looked down at the 6 bodies in the hallway, at the blood on his own hands, at the door that had held. Guess he forgot to tell his buyers what he was actually hiring. The channel crackled again, another voice this time, unfamiliar, clipped with irritation. "East perimeter reports silence. No confirmation from the strike team. Viserian, your intelligence said the human staff posed 0 threat variable." A long pause. Then Viserian's voice again, and Ellis could hear, even through the translator's flat processing, the exact moment the commander's confidence started to crack. That's not possible. He's domestic staff. He mops floors. Your floor mopper has apparently killed 6 of my operatives," the unfamiliar voice said. "I am revising my confidence in this entire operation, Commander. If the princess survives the hour, the contract is void. And so, I suspect, is your continued usefulness to anyone." The channel cut. Sion stared at the dead panel, her whole body trembling now with something past fear, something closer to fury. "He sold me to them," she whispered. "For 3 years he stood behind my father's throne, and he sold me." "Later," Ellis said, forcing the word out through gritted teeth as a fresh wave of pain rolled up from his ribs. "Right now we get you somewhere that isn't a hallway with 6 corpses in it. And then we figure out how deep this goes. You can barely stand. I can stand exactly as long as I need to, Ellis said, and meant it. Because he'd learned a long time ago on cold concrete floors that the body would keep going as long as you refused to give it permission to stop. Where's your father? Yoon's face went pale in a different way. The War Council chamber. He cancelled the reception to meet with the trade delegation there, the same delegation Viserian's been so eager to please all month. Her hands curled into fists. Ellis, if they've turned the commander of the Lumen Guard. My father is sitting in a room right now, surrounded by exactly the men who are supposed to be protecting him. Ellis looked down the long, red-lit hallway, past the bodies, toward the distant doors of the War Council chamber, and felt something settle into place behind his ribs that had nothing to do with the bullet wound. Not rage exactly, something colder and steadier than that. The same flat certainty he used to feel walking into the shop before dawn, knowing exactly what the day required and exactly what it would cost. Then I guess we're going to the War Council chamber, he said, and started walking, blood trailing behind him in slow, dark drops on the white marble, toward the one door in this entire station he hadn't planned on breaking down tonight. The War Council chamber doors were sealed from the inside when Ellis reached them, and through the thick reinforced panel he could hear raised voices, the king's, sharp and demanding, and beneath it, muffled but unmistakable, the low hum of that same brass cylinder that had dropped 6 trained soldiers to the floor without a single blow landed. "They're using it in there," Ione whispered. One hand pressed flat against the door like she could feel the vibration through it. "On my father." "On the council," Ellis looked at the door. Reinforced alloy, sealed from the inside, no obvious release panel, the kind of door built to keep threats out, never designed to consider that the threat might already be standing on the other side of it in ceremonial gold armor. "Is there another way in?" "The service corridor," Ione said, already moving, favoring the same instinct that had kept her alive her whole life, knowing every hidden route through a palace built to look flawless on the surface and function like a machine underneath. Staff use it to bring refreshments during long sessions. "It comes out behind the dais. Show me." She led him at a limping half-run through a narrow servants' passage lined with the same red emergency lighting, past stacked crates of ceremonial dinnerware, until they reached a plain, unmarked door that Ellis had walked past 100 times without ever wondering what was behind it. He pressed his ear to it. Voices closer now. Viserian's unmistakable, stripped of its usual sneering confidence and replaced with something tighter, more desperate. "Understand the difficulty of my position," Viserian was saying. "The human survived. That was never supposed to happen. My intelligence was—" "Your intelligence," the king's voice cut in, cold and precise in a way Ellis had never heard from him before, "was that domestic staff posed zero threat. I'm beginning to suspect, Commander, that your intelligence has been compromised for considerably longer than tonight." A third voice, unfamiliar, translated flat and mechanical, the same voice Ellis had heard through the comm panel, spoke next. "The contract stands regardless of one surviving servant. Sign the transition agreement, Your Majesty, and your daughter's continued good health remains negotiable. Refuse, and we discuss less pleasant arrangements." Ellis looked at Ione. Her jaw was set, her eyes bright with something that had gone past fear entirely and settled somewhere colder. "How many in there?" he asked quietly. "I don't know. My father, Viserian, whatever delegation Viserian's been meeting with all month." She stopped. "Ellis, you're bleeding through your shirt again." "You can barely stand." "I can stand exactly as long as this takes," Ellis said, and reached for the door handle with a hand that wasn't quite steady, and didn't let that stop him either. He'd spent 30 years learning that the body kept a promise longer than most people expected if you refused it the option of quitting. He'd bled out worse than this hauling frozen sides of beef down icy loading ramps in February, alone. 3 in the morning, nobody coming to help. This wasn't so different. Just higher stakes and better lighting. He shouldered the door open. The War Council chamber was a wide, high room dominated by a curved obsidian table. And around it stood exactly what Ellis had expected. Viserion in his ceremonial gold. 4 more Lumen Guard in full armor standing at rigid, unnatural attention. And 3 figures in the same matte grey, wraps he'd already put 6 of on the floor tonight. One of them holding the brass cylinder aimed steadily at the king, who sat pale but unbowed at the head of the table, every head turned toward the sound of the door. Viserion's crest, always so proud, always so ready to flare with offense, went utterly flat. That's not possible. You keep saying that, Ellis said, stepping into the room, blood dripping steadily from his forearm onto the polished floor. Starting to think it's the only thing you're consistently right about tonight. The masked figure with the cylinder didn't hesitate. He turned it on Ellis and thumbed the setting higher, the hum climbing into a pitch that made the chandelier crystals overhead vibrate audibly, and Ellis felt it press against him the same way it had before. Sliding off some old, unreachable nerve, his species had simply never grown. It worked on the 4 Lumen Guards standing at attention instead. All 4 dropped where they stood, convulsing. The same trap-caught sound rising from their throats that Ellis had heard in the East Corridor an hour ago. It didn't work on him. He's immune, the grey-wrapped operative said, voice flat with something that might have been the first real fear Ellis had heard from any of them tonight. The frequency doesn't register. He shouldn't be. This shouldn't be possible. You keep building weapons for creatures that never had to fight for anything, Ellis said, closing the distance, ignoring the pain screaming up his side with every step. Ought to try building one for something that did. The operative dropped the cylinder and reached for a blade instead, and Ellis was already too close for that decision to save him. He caught the wrist, twisted, felt the same wet crack that had ended 3 other fights tonight, and drove the man backward into the obsidian table hard enough to crack the surface. The second grey-wrapped figure lunged from the side. Ellis turned into it instead of away, took the strike across his already wounded ribs with a grunt that tore something loose in his chest, and answered with a headbutt that dropped the man cold before the pain had even finished registering. That left the third, and Viserion, who had gone very still against the far wall, hand hovering near his ceremonial sidearm. Calculating, "Commander," the king said, voice like ice, "you will want to think very carefully about your next decision." Viserion's eyes flicked between the king, the last standing operative, and Ellis, bleeding from 4 wounds now, breathing in short, ragged pulls, and still standing between them and the throne he'd been hired to serve. 3 years of calling this man Waxboy. 3 years of certainty that softness and servitude meant the same thing. He drew the sidearm. Ellis saw it coming a half-second before it fired, and there was no time to close the distance, no time for anything except the flat, cold understanding that this was the shot he wasn't going to walk away from. And then Ione moved. She'd picked up the fallen brass cylinder from the floor without either of them noticing. And she didn't hesitate the way Ellis half expected a 16-year-old princess who'd never fought for anything in her life to hesitate. She thumbed it to its highest setting and pointed it directly at Viserion, and the ancient prey instinct wired into every Serath nervous system since before their species built its first city did exactly what it had been doing all night to everyone, except Ellis. Viserion's shot went wide, punching harmlessly into the ceiling, and the commander of the Lumen Guard, First Blade, terror of the servants' quarters, 3 years of arrogance built entirely on an armor he'd never once had to test, collapsed to the floor, convulsing, betrayed by the same soft, comfortable biology he'd spent his whole life mistaking for strength. The last operative, seeing his employer go down and his squad broken, made the only rational calculation left available to him and bolted for the far door. Ellis let him go. There was nothing left in his legs to chase with, and some fights weren't worth the last of what he had. Silence settled over the War Council chamber, broken only by Viserion's fading whimpers and Ellis's own ragged breathing. The king rose slowly from his chair, looking at the human maid standing bloodied and swaying in the wreckage of his council table, and then at his daughter, still holding the cylinder in both shaking hands, like she wasn't quite sure how she'd become the person capable of using it. "You," the king said quietly, "clean the marble in my east gallery." "Yes, your majesty," Ellis said. And then his knees finally genuinely gave out, and the floor came up to meet him. He woke 3 days later, in a medical suite too clean and too quiet, with Ione asleep in a chair beside his bed, still wearing the same travel-worn robes from that night, refusing, according to the medical staff, to leave except when physically ordered to. "You're an idiot," she told him the moment his eyes opened. Relief and fury tangled together in her voice. He walked into an armed room with 4 bullet wounds. "The physician said you shouldn't have been conscious, let alone standing. Wasn't planning on dying in a hallway," Ellis rasped. "Seemed rude to your father given the circumstances." She almost laughed, and then didn't, her hand finding his on the blanket instead. "The Viserian's in custody." The delegation that hired him turned out to be a splinter faction from the outer trade colonies. They wanted my marriage contract voided so they could install someone more favorable on the council. "My father's ordering a full investigation into every guard rotation on this station." She paused. "He's also asked me to formally thank you. On behalf of the crown. Don't need a formal thank you, princess." "I know." She squeezed his hand. "I wanted to give you one anyway." 3 weeks later, Ellis stood in the East Gallery again, back on his knees with a rag and a bucket, scrubbing candle wax off marble baseboards, his shoulder still stiff, his ribs still aching when he laughed too hard. The old axe hung above his locker where it always had, cleaned now, the blade catching the light the way it had that first terrible night. Above his locker, someone had added a small brass plaque. He hadn't asked who. It read simply, "Cultural Significance. Verified." If you enjoyed watching a 54-year-old butcher take apart an entire assassination plot with his bare hands and a rusty family axe, hit that like button. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people who need a little humanity wins the day energy in their day. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Drop a comment below and tell me what tool your favorite HFY hero should pick up next. And share this with a friend who still believes the quiet ones in the room are usually the most dangerous. Disclaimer. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, species, and events depicted are entirely products of imagination and are not intended to represent any real person, group, or organization.